Hello everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome back to another Final Fantasy XIV news video. This time coming to you with some information out of the recent Famitsu interview that Slicer over on the Blue Garter forums has translated. Thank you, Eludi, for sending me this, and thank you, Slicer, as per usual, for doing your translations of these kind of things. Now, keep in mind that a lot of the details in here are quite similar to some of the other interviews we've talked about recently. Some of the points I'd like to highlight are the difficulty of Alexander, the final Alexander, and where it will be set from now on, the difficulty of jobs in the expansion, and the addition of item level 250 crafted weapons. Now, I actually thought the crafted weapons section would be in this interview. It turns out this is a different interview from the Famitsu interview out of Gamescom, which is where they mention the addition of crafted weapons in patch 3.4. In patch 3.2, we were introduced to high item level crafted armor and accessories, and that seemed to have gone fairly well. In the next patch, there will be equal item level weapons as well, which means that these weapons are likely going to be equal in item level to the next extreme primal weapons. Now, we don't know what the recipes are going to be. Maybe you need items from the primals in order to craft the I-250 weapons. We don't know. All we know is that there are going to be higher item level crafted weapons in the next patch. I just wanted to include that before we start going through this interview. A lot of the things, just like most of the other interviews coming out of Gamescom, how's it feel to be on your 3rd anniversary? He's like, it feels good, but I'm more concerned about the next 3 years as opposed to just being like, wow, we made it 3 years. Let's not focus on how far we've made it. Let's focus on how far we can go. Let's see if we can get this game going for another 3 years. And that's where Yoshi P's mind is right now. There's a lot of very solid understanding of kind of the way that they've sort of looked at feedback in this interview, where he talks about things such as, we listened to people that said that they wanted harder content for Alexander. We learned that that was not a good idea. Now, because they can't make any huge changes to things before the expansion, they pretty much just said that final Alexander will be just outright easier than Midas and Gordius, just in every way pretty much. But there's also going to be a challenge that's still there. He said a lot of times in this interview as well, I expect that the top tier players to be kind of disappointed with some of these news, but this is what we believe is right for the game going forward. Some of those things involve job rotations, which we will see, they can see right here. Might review the actions and make changes to the ones that already exist at level 60. They said that job changes are really not going to be coming until the next expansion, because it's really hard to rebalance how certain things are right now. A big example he lists is Warrior and Scholar are just head and heels above the competition when it comes to what they bring to any sort of group content. So that are going to be looked at in the expansion. They can't really balance those out prior to that. So just keep that in mind, Warriors and Scholars. Your time to shine may not be much past 4.0, which we don't know a release date for just yet. They also talk about how players generally just don't play their jobs properly at level 60. Obviously, properly, as Yoshida says, is more of a thing that we the players have determined whether or not it's proper. But even he says that it seems like people become very confused, especially between levels 50 and 60, where a lot of jobs drastically change. They want to bring things back to basics. He says that word for word right here, we'll be going back to the basics. Managing buffs is a little bit too crazy right now, so we can expect buff management to be brought down quite a bit going into the next expansion. And also, they want to make it just to the point where the top players may feel like it's a bit too easy. So they expect to just basically bring the difficulty of playing jobs down, because as he says, he feels Alexander would have had a higher clear rate if people were using their level 50 rotations, or if Alexander had been released at level 50, because people would have been able to play their jobs more easily. They were simpler back then, and on top of that, they wouldn't have to focus as much on their job as they do on the mechanics of the fight in order to make sure that they're passing it. So they want to bring things back down a little bit, but because they can't do that before the expansion, final Alexander is going to be considerably easier than Midas and Gordius. They also talk a little bit about how ranged DPS lose DPS whenever they get targeted by AoEs and they have to move out of them. But then he also goes to talk about how even when melees are targeted by attacks, or there's ever time where they have downtime on the attack, losing auto attacks is another really big thing that costs melee DPS a considerable amount of their damage. It's one of those kind of things that people don't see until you actually look deep into the numbers, is losing auto attacks on a boss. So they are planning on doing some sort of auto attack revamp sometime in the future, so that should be made maybe a little bit easier, but I can't really tell precisely. They seem to be playing a very vague types of words when it comes to discussing a lot of the changes that they're working on for jobs and whatnot. They talk a little bit about the motivation to do raids right here. One big thing is Japanese characteristics on how they tackle game content versus the West. But the big thing here is just that people feel motivated when they see what the compensation is for raids to do it, and that they just want to make sure there's a proper item reward there at the end. And there's just some people who feel like they aren't enjoying the game if they don't try the raid. A big reason why he thinks that is that it's the first real time that difficult content has been released in a Japanese MMO. Big thing is that you can't just overpower it with more equipment and more people, which was a very common trait in Japanese MMOs prior. So it's definitely having an impact on how players enjoy the game and how players see that content going forward. Here's where they talk about Alexander's difficulty definitely being too high. And yeah, see, he talks mostly about how we're able to clear Midas if the level cap was still 50 with the corresponding skill rotations. He's very confident in that, and personally I agree, but I still don't think the clear rates would be nearly as high as the Binding Coils were. Here's where they talk about job balance and Warrior and Scholar being just completely, like I said, head and heels above the rest of the competition. He says, don't worry, World First teams, they're not going to post World Prog as it's going on the Lodestone, even though that's requested in this interview. Is like, some people, the people who are competing for World First, they definitely don't want this. So we respect that opinion. They won't be doing that. Let's see here. They also talk about how parameters are very imbalanced to some degree. And how basically you can't really tell how much you're benefiting from getting, let's say, 100 critical hit rate or 100 determination outside of very, very strict test conditions. So they're looking to do some substat revamps as well in the expansion. There's a really hot topic right now, whether or not they should keep accuracy. We know that accuracy is always ridiculous. There's this huge monster. Whoop, I guess I can't hit it even though I'm standing right in front of it. So they're really debating whether or not they want to keep accuracy at all going into the next expansion, which you have to consider when it comes to healers. That would mean that healers having 100% accuracy, they would have to consider that, because we all know that healers will never escape being able to do, or being expected to do some level of DPS in the highest tier of raids. We all know that's always going to be some level of mentality that's there with our community. Let's see. Yep, they just don't want to make it too complicated or make the gap with top players too high. They want to make careful adjustments. So they're going to be playing it careful with parameters, essentially. And then they just talk about specific mechanics here, like how people identify the towers as mechanics that you stand in, or shared damage markers as, hey, everyone needs to split this damage. Just sort of the mentality that goes with it, places where we first seen those kinds of markers and whatnot. They want to, when they create new mechanics, they want to use new markers, but they want to make sure that the markers are somewhat consistent. That way, players know how to recognize a specific type of content. They don't want just different markers for the same thing over and over again. But when they create new mechanics, they'll have a new marker that becomes like the standard for identifying that mechanic. Kind of like how they did it with dive bombs, how they had like 3 different markers, but we eventually just figured out they all essentially did nearly the same thing, just with slight differences. And then they talk a lot about production here. The production pattern is roughly the same for everyone. Produce endgame content and how our mechanics developed. We learned that they take about 5 to 7 days to balance one instance, I believe. And then this is just talking about the process of how, hey, we have to start designing it, and then we have to worry about the monster and animation team, and then once they're done, we have the lighting, and then we need to see the effects that the monsters emit for each skill, and then we got to test the difficulty, and we got to test it with invincibility on and test it with invincibility off. We got to check for bugs and all that stuff. So they basically just detail the development process of endgame content right there. And then it all ends with a playtest, essentially. They test things like DPS checks, damage checks, what mechanics they expect certain members of the party to be able to do, what's feasible, what's not feasible, how many people do they feel will be able to clear the content, all kinds of things that we kind of expect them to check. And then, of course, they do a final check with the debug commands where it's possible to wipe. They don't only do content with the invincibility mode on. They do also do content with just straight up non-invincibility, like you and I would experience a fight. That way they can make sure that it's, somewhat feasible. They just can't spend hours and hours and hours doing it with barely the minimum item level of gear to see how everything interacts, because then that would take way, way too long. Let's see, what else do we have here? Decided on a script for enemy actions at the first stage of specifications. Okay, so now they're talking about how they determine, you know, how often certain abilities are used and during what phases and if they stop using a mechanic. There's a lot of things that go into these kind of decisions, and I know that you guys don't expect there to not be a lot. It's just that there's so many details here, I can't sit here and detail all of them. They also said that the enemy attacks come in 3 kinds: physical, magical, and non-attribute. For those of you who don't know, there are attacks in the game referred to as darkness attacks. A darkness attack is an attack that can't be mitigated in any way, or its mitigations are very limited. You can't mitigate it basically with things like reducing magic output or reducing physical output. You can only outright mitigate the damage with shields or with flat damage mitigation, things like Storm's Path or Sacred Soil. And then you have darkness damage that just goes straight through all that crap. So essentially keep that in mind. What's being asked here is if they can make that more distinguishable. And he's saying that that would be tough to do that. I personally don't agree that it would be tough to do that. It's eventually obvious, but there's always some boss mechanics that you're just surprised to find out are magic damage, or you're surprised to find out are physical damage. So changing the attribute of an attack is kind of a last resort for performing job balance. If we want to recreate effects, we wait for checks, we would miss our schedule. He basically says that if they wanted to let us identify every single attack, it would probably take longer in the balancing periods, but I mean, I don't know. I don't entirely agree with that, but that is basically what came out of the Famitsu interview. It was nothing brand new, with the 14-hour broadcast tonight starting at 8 p.m. Pacific and with the live letter at 9 p.m. Pacific. That's where we're expecting to get the next big chunk of details, and I will have a video out about that pretty much within a couple of hours of it being finished. I'll probably take an extra hour to sleep in after that, because that's going to take a pretty long time. The rest of the 14-hour broadcast is a bunch of other things. Adrenaline Rush TV, we expect them to maybe announce or showcase some new PvP features there. We have community streams, we have Yoshi's P Room, and we expect a few other things to get leaked along the way. Also, one last reminder, the Moonfire Fair will be finishing very shortly, in under 12 hours. So if you haven't finished that yet, you may want to get on that. And the Rising event will be beginning tomorrow as well. I will have a video on that, so we can all enjoy that as well. That's all the news that I have for the time being. Everyone, thank you for watching this video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and check out all of the Final Fantasy count-up uploads that are going to be coming. There's going to be one at 5 a.m. and one at 3:30 p.m. every day until we have all of the Final Fantasy series uploaded onto my channel. It's footage that's coming straight from the live stream, so there's going to be things like me talking to chat, or me getting, you know, a follow or a sub or cheers or tips or whatever, and I know that's going to take a little bit away from the gameplay itself, but hopefully what I'm able to add in commentary adds to the gameplay as well. Anyway, be sure to check those videos out. I will see you guys in the next video. I'm going to do a separate reminder video for the live letter tonight, and until then, everyone, take care.